Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio. Welcome to Policy and Rights, the show about government policy and human rights. Welcome back to Policy and Rights here on Depictions Media Radio. I am your host, Michael Clogs. Well, they have come to a ceasefire agreement in Gaza. It is hinging, of course, on return of hostages, and there are a few other conditions that need to be met, but a ceasefire is in place, and humanitarian efforts can move from Egypt into the Gaza Strip. And there has been immense damage done in the area, where hospitals have been shut down, and at one point we're going to hear from one United Nations expert is going to say that right now the Gaza Strip is probably the most dangerous place in the world to be a child. That is extremely significant. We're going to hear, of course, from the United Nations press floor. We're also going to hear from Justin Trudeau as he speaks about the significance of having a ceasefire. We're also going to hear in segments on Ukraine and the Russian Federation having some significant things to say about the conditions in the Ukraine and agreements made with the European Union and how that's affecting what is going on in the Ukraine. There was also a report in the Globe and Mail this morning about how Canada has become so expensive that the Ukrainian refugees are choosing to go back to Ukraine rather than stay here because of the struggles that they're facing trying to live in Canada, which is a very interesting thing to say when we consider that there are significant struggles going on there with the fact that there's a war going on there, that there are attacks, bombings, missile strikes, drone strikes, all that sort of stuff happening in Ukraine right now because they're in conflict with Russia. And the families are deciding to go back rather than stay here in Canada because of financial struggles. The question would be, has Canada truly become that expensive? So we're going to hear from the Russian Federation, the permanent representative from the Russian Federation to the United Nations, as he speaks about some of the things that or required of Ukraine in order for them to become part of the European Union. Some of it may be slanted more towards the fact that Russia is not exactly friendly with the European Union or many Western countries, and there have been decades of tension between Russia and Western countries. So there is going to be a slant towards that. We're also going to hear from the Security Council, where a representative who is actually in Ukraine talking about some of the needs of the people, because wintertime is coming to that region, and things like fuel oil and heating and alike are going to, of course, be needed so that people can stay warm and have a safe home. So the theme of the day is we need to end the conflicts so that people can actually live. So why don't we move forward, and why don't we start with some of the statements made around the ceasefire in Gaza.
Do you have any comments on the allegations that the Americans ordered a plot to potentially kill a sick American?
We have been working closely with our allies, including the Americans, since the middle of the summer. Obviously, we continue to engage with India in hopefully constructive ways, and we hope that India will continue to take these real concerns seriously.
Was this brought up in the G20 meeting this morning at all?
I re-emphasize how important it is to abide by the rule of law and to engage constructively with each other when we have issues of concern.
What are your thoughts on the ceasefire in
Les coûts de la
Israel?
dette, là, qu'est-ce que vous dites aux Canadiens qui voient les chiffres, 350 millions en intérêt sur la carte de crédit du gouvernement au cours des 6 prochaines années, qui s'inquiètent?
Ouais, on est en train d'investir dans des choses qui vont créer de la croissance économique, qui vont aider les familles. Investir dans le logement, ça va créer des opportunités pour tous, ça va créer de la croissance économique dans laquelle tout le monde va pouvoir participer. Investir dans l'économie de l'avenir, des jobs, des carrières, que ce soit Northvolt, que ce soit Volkswagen, que ce soit l'économie du futur. C'est le genre de choses qui sont essentielles. On continue de démontrer une responsabilité fiscale. On a la meilleure ratio dette PIB au G7. On a le plus bas déficit du G7. On continue d'avoir une cote triple A par les agences d'évaluation. On est dans une piste responsable et on est en train d'aider les Canadiens. C'est ce que les gens veulent.
Est-ce que c'est un bon signe? Est-ce que c'est le début de la fin pour vous?
On en a parlé ce matin longuement au niveau du sommet virtuel du G20. On a une pause humanitaire qui est ce qu'on demande depuis des semaines. Le Canada a appelé pour ça. On est en train de voir, on l'espère, des otages enfin libérés. On va avoir de l'aide humanitaire significative rentrer dans Gaza. Et on va voir la protection de civils. Mais maintenant, on doit prendre avantage de ce moment pour travailler sur une paix plus durable, faire les étapes nécessaires pour ça. Et on a tous un peu d'espoir avec ce progrès, mais on a beaucoup de travail à faire encore. We talked at length about the situation in Gaza this morning on our G20 summit. The reality is this humanitarian pause is what Canada and others have been calling for weeks now. It is going to allow for hostages to finally be liberated. It's going to allow for significant amounts of humanitarian aid to get into the civilians and the innocent people in Gaza who desperately need it. And it's going to allow for protecting of civilian life, including hopefully getting even more Canadians and foreign nationals out. This is an important bit of progress, but we have to redouble our efforts now to get towards a lasting
so we're
peace.
going to hear from Dr. Mike Ryan from the WHO. He is one of the directors of emergency health and he's based in Geneva. So why don't we hear what Dr. Mike Ryan has to say about the conditions in Gaza as we were leading into the ceasefire.
All right, good afternoon. So we're delighted to be joined by colleagues from the World Health Organization. We have with us Dr. Mike Ryan, the Executive Director of WHO's Health Emergencies Programme, and he is in Geneva. And with some luck, we should have Rob Holden, WHO Senior Emergency Officer, who is joining us from Gaza. But I do know we have some problems connecting Rob. They will obviously be talking to you about the situation of the health sector in Gaza and the recent evacuation from Al-Shifa. So without further ado, Mike, you go ahead, and hopefully Rob will join us.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. I presume it's just about hit the afternoon there, and pleasure to join you, and thanks for the opportunity to brief you on the health situation in Gaza. And around the region as well. We've been tracking both the deaths and fatalities in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, both in the West Bank and in Gaza. Today I'll focus on the Gaza situation, but that in no way detracts from the death and suffering that's occurred in other places. And might I say, on World Children's Day, where so many children have died, and so many children still remain in danger. Many children are still hostages. That on the day in which we celebrate the Declaration of the Rights of the Child, that we think very hard about the situation we're in, and absolutely try to find solutions to ease the suffering and pain of all people affected by this conflict. And with that in mind, I will focus on the situation in the Gaza Strip. We've had great difficulty in updating the detailed disaggregated numbers that we've been providing to you all over the last number of weeks. The estimates for fatalities and deaths at this point is very unclear, but it continues to rise. There is no question of that. The last verified numbers we had were last Friday, which was just over 11,000 fatalities. But it has certainly risen to then, and the Ministry of Health in Gaza have reported obviously much higher numbers of that, and we will continue to try and get back to having more detailed disaggregated data. But again, this is one of the unfortunate things that happens in a situation like this, where health systems are collapsing. It is very hard to maintain good data. The vast majority of people who have been killed are women and children, and there are still large numbers of people missing. And this could include up to 1,500 children. The health system in Gaza is under extreme pressure. The vast majority of health hospitals are closed. There are only 10 of the 36 health hospitals that were functioning in Gaza now functioning in any way at all, and even they are struggling to function. Almost all of the health facilities in the northern part of Gaza, north of the Wadi Gaza line, have ceased functioning as hospital facilities, and at this stage, obviously, you've seen and watched the unfolding situation at Al-Shifa Hospital, but there are also other facilities like the Indonesian hospital, which are now coming under extreme pressure as well, and may need and the health staff there may be requesting some form of evacuation in the coming days. The scale of injuries, the need for supplies, the inability to move around within the strip, and the inability to do that safely has placed huge strains on all of the UN community and NGO community to serve the people on the ground. Beyond the risks of direct wounds and injuries, which are very severe, we're seeing large numbers of people packed into refuges, packed into UNRWA schools, packed into various other kinds of centres. This is creating a concentration of people which is driving epidemic risks. And the rains over the last 24 hours have really added to that. There really has been heavy rain. It has flooded a lot of the makeshift camps, and it is generating all kinds of risks. And it's not just the risks of diarrheal disease. The sudden drop in temperature is going to create a problem with pneumonia in children, the stress that those kids are under, the nutritional status that those children have, make it a recipe for epidemics. This is an absolute recipe for large-scale epidemics amongst this population, and that, as a public health risk, right now will begin to approach the same level as the injury crisis that we have and the crisis in the hospitals. Nutrition in itself is a major challenge, and our colleagues in WFP, I'm sure, have briefed you. But nutrition is the baseline for health. Nutrition is the baseline for child development. And right now, the calorific intake and the quality of that for children particularly has reduced below a critical level. So a lot has been done to try and address this. A lot has been done to try and bring in supplies. But frankly speaking, many of the health workers themselves have become displaced, and maintaining the existing health system. Before this crisis, we had approximately 3,500 beds throughout Gaza available to serve patients. Now that is less than 1,400, and many of those 1,400 beds are now difficult to support with supplies, difficult to support with health workers, and becoming increasingly difficult to sustain going into the next few weeks. Our biggest fear at the moment is also a shift or another movement of patients. 1.7 million people have already been displaced. There is a real risk that many of them will be displaced again. And again, the further concentration of people in ever smaller areas pushing out to the West Coast is only increasing the risks to those populations, be it from injury, but more importantly, be it from the public health risks. So we really do need to take a step back here, understand the risks that are being taken, and hopefully have a ceasefire, hopefully have all of the hostages released, and hopefully get to a position where we will have unfettered access with our UN partners and NGO partners to support all people affected in this crisis. With that, I will hand back to you. I don't know if...
Okay, so we're going to move on to the United Nations press floor for a statement from the UN about the ceasefire in Gaza and other things that are happening around the world with conflict and humanitarian efforts.
Good afternoon and happy day before Thanksgiving to one and all who showed up. The Secretary General has welcomed the agreement reached by Israel and Hamas with the mediation of Qatar and supported by Egypt and the United States. This is an important step in the right direction, but much more needs to be done. The United Nations will mobilize all its capacities to support the implementation of the agreement and maximize its positive impact on the humanitarian situation in Gaza. The Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, reports that yesterday, 63,800 liters of fuel entered Gaza from Egypt. Fuel is being distributed by the UN Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, to support food distribution and the operation of generators at hospitals, water and sanitation facilities, shelters, and other critical services. A total of 79 trucks carrying humanitarian supplies entered from Egypt by yesterday evening. Overall, between the 21st of October and the 21st of November, at least 1,399 truckloads of humanitarian supplies, excluding fuel, have entered Gaza through the Egyptian border, compared to a monthly average of nearly 10,000 truckloads of commercial and humanitarian commodities, excluding fuel, entering Gaza before the 7th of October. Also yesterday, Al-Shifa Hospital in North Gaza was attacked, and 3 doctors and 1 patient's companion were killed, and many patients injured. Since the start of the war, the World Health Organization has documented 178 health attacks in Gaza Strip that resulted in 22 fatalities and 48 injuries among healthcare workers on duty. Only 2 small hospitals to the north of Wadi Gaza, one in Gaza City and another in Beit Lahia, are estimated to be partially operational and admit patients, with the remaining 22 being out of service. Of the 11 medical facilities in the south, 7 are currently functional. A WHO staff member was killed alongside her 6-month-old baby, her husband, and 2 brothers yesterday. As of the 19th of November, 108 UNRWA staffers have been killed in Gaza since the 7th of October. Nearly 770,000 internally displaced persons, one out of 1.7 million, are sheltering in 99 UNRWA facilities south of Wadi Gaza in extremely overcrowded conditions. In the past 2 weeks, the agency has recorded a 35% increase in skin diseases and a 40% increase in cases of diarrhea. For her part, the humanitarian coordinator for the occupied Palestinian territory, Lynn Hastings, says the UN and our humanitarian partners stand ready to seize this opportunity to increase humanitarian operations wherever people in need are. She stressed that the parties need to allow for humanitarian operations to be conducted across the Gaza Strip where people are in need, especially in the north. Ms. Hastings emphasized that civilians in Gaza cannot depend on humanitarian aid alone. The entry of commercial goods needs to resume, especially through the Kerem Shalom crossing, which has the capacity for it. Catherine Russell, the executive director of the UN Children's Fund, briefed the Security Council today and said that UNICEF also welcomes the limited ceasefire agreement. She said that since the 7th of October, 35 Israeli children have reportedly been killed, while more than 30 have been held hostage in Gaza. Meanwhile, she said, more than 5,300 Palestinian children have been reportedly killed in just 46 days, or over 115 a day, every day, for weeks and weeks. Based on these figures, children account for 40% of the deaths in Gaza, Ms. Russell said. So in other words, the Gaza Strip is the most dangerous place in the world to be a child. Sima Bahous, the head of UN Women, told the Council that not only is the number of civilians killed since the 7th of October twice that of the last 15 years combined, now 67% of the more than 14,000 people killed in Gaza are estimated to be women and children. Ms. Bahous said that UN Women has met with and heard from Israeli women who shared that they and civil society organizations are working to document gender-based atrocities. They also shared their hope for peace with women, both Israeli and Palestinian, at the table. Natalia Kanem, the executive director of the UN Population Fund, UNFPA, also briefed the Security Council, adding that in Gaza there are currently 5,500 pregnant women expected to give birth in the coming month. Every day, approximately 180 women deliver under appalling conditions, the futures for the newborns uncertain. She said that the situation is most dire for women facing obstetric complications, some 15% of pregnant women. The Undersecretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, Rosemary DiCarlo, completed today a visit to Israel, the occupied Palestinian territory, and Jordan. The war in Gaza and the 7th of October attacks that triggered it were at the center of her discussions. On the 19th and 20th of November, in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, the Undersecretary General met with President Isaac Herzog and other senior Israeli officials, as well as with families of Israeli hostages taken on the 7th of October. On the 21st of November in Ramallah, she held talks with Prime Minister Mohammed Shtayyeh and other Palestinian leaders. She also met with the Palestinian Red Crescent leadership. During the visit, Undersecretary General DiCarlo spent time with UN staff, including from UNRWA, who've been working to bring needed relief to civilians in Gaza. She paid tribute to the many UN colleagues who have paid the ultimate price during the violence. Undersecretary General DiCarlo concluded her visit today with meetings in Amman, Jordan. Throughout her visit, Undersecretary General DiCarlo expressed her deep concern over the continued loss of life in Gaza following the abhorrent attacks of the 7th of October. She reiterated the Secretary General's 3 priorities regarding a humanitarian ceasefire and improved humanitarian access in the Strip, the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, and preventing the escalation or expansion of the conflict. We have a full note with more details. Today in Santiago, Chile, the Secretary General participated in the G20 virtual summit, which is being hosted by the Indian government. He told G20 leaders that our world, and particularly developing countries, is facing a perfect storm with growing inequalities, climate chaos, conflicts, and hunger. He said that G20 members can help lead the way in the areas of financial, structural, and climate justice. The Secretary General said that India's G20 presidency reminded us that we are one Earth and one family with one future. So let's act like it, he told leaders. His remarks were sent to you. And this evening he will be making his way to Antarctica with President Gabriel Boric. In Kinshasa yesterday, the head of our UN mission in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, MONUSCO, Bintou Keita, and the Congolese Vice Prime Minister, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Francophonie, Christophe Lutundula, co-signed a note on the accelerated, graduated, orderly, and responsible withdrawal of MONUSCO from the DRC, containing a plan and a timeline for the complete disengagement of the mission in the country. You will recall that in September, the president of the DRC, Felix Tshisekedi, reiterated his country's desire to accelerate the withdrawal of MONUSCO from the DRC starting next month. Following the Security Council presidential statement of the 16th of October, this disengagement plan was developed by joint technical teams bringing together government and MONUSCO counterparts. The plan will be jointly implemented in 3 phases, with the support of the DRC's international and national partners. In a statement issued by the mission this morning, Bintou Keita thanked our Congolese partners and reiterated our determination to work with the Congolese authorities towards an accelerated withdrawal of MONUSCO that consolidates the gains made during the mission's presence in the DRC. After the mission's departure, the UN system will continue to support the development efforts of the Congolese government and people with the aim of sustaining peace-building and security gains in the country. Our peace-building colleagues in the Central African Republic, MINUSCA, report that a new agreement has been signed between communities in Obo. This marks an important step towards reconciliation and peace in the Haut-Mbumu prefecture in the southeast. The commitment involved representatives from 3 key groups, the Muslim and indigenous communities, as well as the Zande self-defense group. One of the key provisions is the affirmation of the free movement of people and goods, which will help to reduce tensions, build trust, and a sense of shared responsibility for the well-being and security of the population. MINUSCA says that this agreement will make a vital contribution to the overall peace-building strategy, helping to reduce violence and lay the foundations for long-term stability. You will have seen that we issued a statement last night where the Secretary General strongly condemned the launch of yet another military satellite using ballistic technology by the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. He added that any launch by the DPRK using ballistic missile technology is contrary to the relevant Security Council resolutions. The Secretary General reiterated his call on Democratic People's Republic of Korea to fully comply with its international obligations under all relevant Security Council resolutions and to return to dialogue without preconditions to achieve the goal of sustainable peace and the complete and verifiable denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. As you know, yesterday afternoon, the Security Council held a meeting on maintenance of peace and security of Ukraine. Briefing Security Council members, Miroslav Yencha, the Assistant Secretary General for Europe, Central Asia, and the Americas, at the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, noted that amidst fresh waves of attacks against energy infrastructure and in anticipation of frigid weather conditions, humanitarian needs in Ukraine are on the rise. Also briefing Council members, the World Food Programme Country Director in Ukraine, Matthew Hollingworth, said that if attacks on food infrastructure and the blockage of sea export routes continues, it will dramatically impact the agricultural production outlook over years to come, and in the worst case scenario may lead to wheat production being unable to meet domestic and export demand. We have a humanitarian update on Myanmar, where our humanitarian colleagues tell us that intense fighting between ethnic armed organizations and the Myanmar armed forces continues and has expanded into more areas, including densely populated urban centers. This escalation is the largest and most geographically widespread since the 2021 military takeover. Northern and southern Shan, Sagaing, Kaya, Rakhine, and southern Chin are particularly affected. Our humanitarian partners on the ground note that as of yesterday, more than 286,000 people have been displaced since the escalation of fighting on October 26th, with this number continuing to climb. The security situation in Rakhine remains alarming, particularly in Paktao Township, where some 20,000 people have fled to safer locations since the middle of this month. According to our humanitarian partners, entry points to downtown Paktao have been closed and the town is not accessible. Hundreds of people are reportedly trapped and have not been able to move to safer areas. Some 26,000 Rohingya also remain unreachable in 5 sites for internally displaced people in Paktao and have not had access to humanitarian assistance since November 10th. Many transport routes in parts of the country affected by conflict remain blocked, with airports closed and telecommunication services disrupted. Despite these challenges, our partners continue to provide life-saving assistance to civilians wherever they can and are assessing growing needs. The most urgent needs include cash, food, shelter, hygiene kits, basic health services, and protection support. The humanitarian response plan for Myanmar is currently only 28% funded, with just a few weeks left in the year. With more than 2 million people now displaced nationwide, we need an urgent injection of funding and safe access to respond effectively to escalating needs at scale. In the Dominican Republic, our teams tell us that unprecedented rainfall has killed more than 24 people and displaced almost 18,000 in the past 5 days. More than 3,500 homes have been affected, and at least 45 communities remain completely isolated. Our UN team, led by Resident Coordinator Mauricio Ramirez Villegas, is supporting the government in conducting a rapid needs assessment, while also distributing non-food items such as hygiene kits, tarpaulins, solar lamps, and mosquito nets. Our colleagues are distributing a limited number of items pre-positioned in the country, but much more is needed, including food. Infrastructure, housing, and agriculture are expected to be some of the most affected sectors. Our UN team is concerned about significant damage to people's lives and livelihoods, including small businesses, as well as recently confirmed outbreaks of dengue fever and cholera in affected areas. As you know, tomorrow is Thanksgiving Day, and UN headquarters will be closed for the holiday. There won't be a briefing tomorrow or on Friday unless any big change of circumstances warrants it. We'll be at work on Friday and will post the latest highlights of the UN system online. As Stefan told you, on Monday, we expect the Secretary General may do a press stakeout.
And we're going to hear now from the Russian Federation as they speak about conditions in Ukraine. Of course, with their slant being, well, they're the folks that are attacking the Ukraine under the idea they say that they're trying to liberate them from the Western threat.
Dear colleagues, today's meeting of the Security Council, which was requested by the USA and Albania, presented a good opportunity to discuss the 10th anniversary of the so-called Euromaidan in Kiev, a wave of civil unrest orchestrated by the West, followed by bloodshed that led to the unconstitutional coup d'etat. This coup triggered a chain of tragic events which resulted in a systemic crisis of statehood in Ukraine we are observing now. Let me recall how it all started. On November 21st, 2013, the Ukrainian government suspended preparations for signing this association agreement with the European Union. I would like to underscore that this decision was absolutely legitimate and substantiated, guided by the need to ensure sovereign national interests of Ukraine. The Ukrainian economy was obviously threatened by the unhindered inflow of European goods while being unable to meet EU standards for its own export. Simply speaking, contrary to the Western fairy tales about the bright prospects of integration into Europe, Ukraine, after agreeing to sign that association agreement, was doomed to become a subordinate source of commodities and raw goods, as well as cheap labor force for Europe. In a way, the plan was to replace a notorious Polish plumber with a Ukrainian housemaid. Regrettably, this is what actually happened when the agreement was eventually embraced by Maidan authorities. And now even pro-European Ukrainians admit that the agreement was disadvantageous and its implementation did more harm than good. We are not surprised by these assessments, not only because we warned about these consequences 10 years ago, but also because we know this is a typical scheme of neo-colonial exploitation by Western countries that they impose on all those who agree to implement their geopolitical agenda. A very illustrious example of a treacherous promise of European solidarity for Ukraine. You all remember how Poland recently closed its borders to protect its farmers and markets from cheap Ukrainian products. At the same time, Ukraine was then, back in 2013, expected to open its markets in exchange for minuscule quotas, failing in any sort of trade competition with the EU. With this in mind, it's easier to answer the question why the decision of the Ukrainian government to postpone consideration of this agreement was met with so well organized and coordinated protests. We have no doubt about the key role of the EU and the USA in igniting, encouraging and directing the protest of a loud minority using far-right radicals and neo-Nazis as a leverage. Victoria Nuland admitted in 2014 that the US invested $5 billion to prepare for such a scenario well in advance. After they led nationalists to power, they later covered them up in brutal crimes against their own people in Odessa, Mariupol, and the war against the Donbass. We all know that even the internationally approved basis for the settlement of the Ukrainian crisis, the 2015 Minsk agreements, were from the very beginning a smokescreen by Kyiv and its European sponsors to buy time to arm Ukraine and prepare it for a war with Russia. I would like to stress that, contrary to the Western propaganda, the promise of Maidan was nothing else but a bait. Ukraine has to give up everything, its sovereignty, the right to determine its future, its historic, cultural, Slavic background, and religious ties with Russia, so that its more and more corrupt elite could receive perks from its Western sponsors while sending the ordinary people to the battlefield to die for them. This was the initial plot from the outset, as it is absolutely clear today. The history of Maidan is important in order to understand the origins of the current decline and erosion of Ukraine as a state. It should serve as a warning for everyone who is being cajoled by the West in its criminal pursuit of new pawns to promote its devastating and selfish geopolitical agenda. Therefore, we are organizing an ARIA formula meeting specifically on this topic on December 8th, when we'll give the floor to the participants of those events. Moreover, immediately after this stakeout, the permanent mission of Russia will go live on Twitter to webcast a documentary by the Russia Today, Maidan, the Road to War. The film was shot from 2014 to 2022 as the Donetsk and Lugansk regions were subjected from 2014 to 2022 as the Donetsk and Lugansk regions were subjected to daily shelling by the Kyiv regime. This documentary delves into the 2014 situation in Ukraine and pieces together the course of events. Once again, the webcast will start right now. I invite all of you to join. Thank you.
Ambassador, could you bring us up to date on Russia's talks with Iran on providing Moscow with ballistic missiles for use in Ukraine?
I have no news about such talks with Iran. Sorry.
Or about Wagner at the direction of the government providing Hezbollah or Iran with some sort of air defense capability?
I think this is a complete fake. If you're referring to the article in Washington Post, I mean, this is a disgrace of journalism, the article that you mentioned and quote.
Mr. Bente, on the anniversary of Maidan...
On what?
Anniversary of Maidan that happened today, Charles Michel came in Kiev. What do you think that means?
First of all, it's a sad anniversary. I wouldn't call it even an anniversary. There's just a date that marks the 10th year after it all happened. I think that he should have come to apologize to Ukrainians for all the promises that the EU made to them and could not and cannot fulfill. Thank you very much.
Okay, now we're going to hear from a representative from Ukraine as he talks about conditions and the need for some sort of armistice, especially for the winter, because of the conditions and the winter time in the region between Russia and Ukraine. So why don't we listen to that as they address the UN Security Council floor.
Mr. President, last weekend we reached a new grim milestone in the war in Ukraine. The Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights has confirmed that to date More than 10,000 civilians have been killed and more than 18,500 injured since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in violation of the UN Charter and international law. Hundreds of children are among the victims. The full toll of this war is likely to be much greater, as there is no sign of the end of the violence. Instead, there are indications that attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure may escalate further during the upcoming coldest season. The impact for millions of Ukrainians will be dire as they brace themselves for the second wartime winter. Since I last briefed this council less than 2 weeks ago, Russian aerial attacks across the country have continued to inflict death and destruction to areas near and far from the front lines. On 11 November, Kiev was attacked by missiles, first time in 2 months. While the capital was spared from casualties that night, attacks on Kiev and its region have continued. The city was attacked by drones just this weekend. On the same day, strikes killed 4 people, 2 in Kherson, 1 in Dnipropetrovsk, and another in Zaporizhia region, according to local officials. The city of Kherson, recaptured by Ukraine over a year ago, has continued to suffer regular intense bombardments, resulting in civilian deaths. Last week, at least 9 people were reportedly killed in the region, and 25 more, including a 2-month-old child, injured. In the Black Sea, the risk of escalation and spillover remains. On 9 November, in Odessa, a missile reportedly hit a cargo vessel, killing a port worker and wounding crew members of the ship. Landmines posing risks to civilian navigation have been reported. A military incident in the Black Sea, whether intentional or not, could result in dangerous escalation. Global food security depends on the ability of food exports to move safely and predictably through international waters, including in the Black Sea. We once again stress that attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure are prohibited under international law. Wherever they occur, they are unacceptable and must stop immediately. Mr. President, amidst fresh waves of attacks against energy infrastructure and in anticipation of frigid weather conditions, humanitarian needs are on the rise. Last Friday's drone strikes alone resulted in power cuts in more than 400,000 villages in the south, southeast, and north of the country. They also damaged an oil depot in Odessa. This year's winter response plan, developed by the United Nations and its partners in full cooperation with the Ukrainian authorities, is already in full swing. International solidarity and support for winter and beyond, including through timely donor contributions, remains essential. Some 360,000 people have already received winter support, but $435 million are still urgently required to deliver house repair materials, winter clothes, heating appliances, fuel, and repairs to district water and heating systems for 1.7 million people in need. Continued contributions are also needed for the 2023 humanitarian response plan for Ukraine, currently only 54% funded. UN agencies have provided humanitarian assistance to over 10 million people this year. We aim to reach 11 million by the end of 2023. Regrettably, around 4 million Ukrainians in need cannot be reached in Russian-controlled areas of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia regions of Ukraine due to lack of access. They receive only minimal aid through local actors, in partnership with the UN and international non-governmental organizations. Humanitarian partners are ready to expand operations in these areas if given access and adequate support. Mr. President, the destruction wrought on the country will take years, decades to overcome. The United Nations is actively working towards long-term recovery and rebuilding of the country's energy sector. We focus on infrastructure support for energy generation and transmission for the functioning of basic utilities, heating, water, and sewage in war-affected areas. In collaboration with the government of Ukraine, the World Bank, and the European Union, the United Nations has initiated the third Ukraine Rapid Damage and Needs Assessment. It will guide the Ukrainian government's investment priorities for recovery and reconstruction next year. The previous assessment has had estimated recovery costs for Ukraine at over $400 billion. We are committed to advancing an inclusive recovery based on rights and local needs in communities affected by the war, leaving no one behind. Regrettably, this war continues to cause often irreversible damage to Ukraine's education sites and hinder children's right to education. The Ukrainian authorities have reported that 365 educational institutions were destroyed and at least 3,428 damaged. We are also concerned about the disregard of international law in the regions of Ukraine currently under Russian control. Russian officials are holding so-called elections, appointing Russian judges, and applying Russian law, even retroactively. Policies aimed at forcefully changing or imposing institutions and identities have far-reaching consequences and are unacceptable. The UN Human Rights Office has also continued to document cases confirming that the use of torture has been widespread in the context of arbitrary detention in territories of Ukraine that are currently under Russian control. Accountability for all violations of human rights must be ensured in line with international norms and standards. Mr. President, in September, the Secretary General urged all countries to do their part to prevent further escalation in Ukraine and to lay the foundations for sustainable peace. Instead, attacks have increased and conditions on the ground deteriorated. While prospects for peace may seem distant and the risk of further escalation looms, urgent efforts must be undertaken to minimize the impact on civilians. Amidst global challenges and crises, the international community must sustain its focus on Ukraine and end the suffering caused by this war. As the Secretary General underlined, peace in Ukraine must remain a priority. A just and lasting peace, in line with the Charter, international law, and the resolutions of the General Assembly. We remain ready to support all meaningful efforts to that end. Thank you.
Okay, so we heard from a lot of the players around the world with different conflicts, and let's focus on this. The most dangerous place to be a child, and WHO Representative Dr. Mike Ryan talking about healthcare conditions in Gaza. What do we more do we need to know in order to stop with the armed conflicts and start settling our differences at a negotiation table. How many children must die in order for us to see this? How many people must lose their lives in order for us to understand that let's talk, not shoot? Basically it. For all of our friends that are listening to us in the United States, because hey, we're recording this the day before Thanksgiving. May you have a healthy and happy Thanksgiving. May there be safety for everyone around the world every day that we are all breathing on this planet Earth that we call home. This show has been produced by Depictions Media. Please contact us at depictions.media for more information.